Stay-home orders have been issued in most countries around the world due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Health experts and most of the public agree that the best way to stay safe and stop the spread of the virus is to stay home. But what happens when home isn't that safe?
With more and more people staying home as a result of the coronavirus, it's causing concern for a different problem: domestic violence.
There are troubling new numbers to tell you about, showing the rise in rates of domestic abuse across the country.
Talian kasih yang turut merekodkan peningkatan lebih 100% berbanding waktu sebelumnya.
There is a pattern playing out across the world where calls regarding domestic violence have spiked since stay-at-home orders were implemented. Spain's emergency number received 18% more calls since their lockdown, and calls to China's helplines reportedly tripled, according to the UN. London alone has seen charges and cautions for domestic violence rise by 24%, an average of 100 people a day for domestic violence offenses. And the trend continues with Malaysia. Distress calls regarding domestic violence have been on the rise since the movement control order began on March 18th. Under Malaysian law, domestic violence is commonly referred to as violence against women within a family. The term includes causing physical injury, psychological and sexual abuse, financial withholding, threatening one's safety, and slander through any means of communication. Although men can also be targets, women make up for the majority of cases due to power imbalances rooted in physical, cultural, and economic inequalities. It's an ongoing and underreported problem that's so often dismissed as just a private family matter. Welfare hotlines like Talian Kasih, who support children and domestic abuse survivors, recorded a 57% surge in calls during the MCO. Women's Aid Organization, an NGO that advocates for survivors of domestic violence, also reported a 44% increase of inquiries since the start of the MCO. In the first half of April, inquiries actually doubled compared to a similar period in February. Although the number of distress calls are rising, police reports on domestic violence have actually fallen from 408 cases pre-MCO to 353 cases during the MCO. Other areas have also seen a dip in police reports, like in Queens, New York. Domestic violence arrests have fallen nearly 40%. In Buenos Aires, Argentina, reports have dropped from 50 to 5 a day under the quarantine. Things seem pretty quiet. What could this pattern mean? Well, first we have to understand that helpline calls aren't the same thing as police reports. In Buenos Aires, the drop in police reports actually indicate that survivors of abusive households are facing greater barriers in notifying authorities, filing complaints, and seeking help, putting them at more risk than ever.
So there are, three reasons why domestic violence survivors are more at risk during this time. The first is that domestic violence really is about maintaining power and control. And in a time of crisis where there's a lot of uncertainty, like stress and financial insecurities, could aggravate an abuser's desire to maintain power and control. Secondly, survivors are trapped all day in the house with the abuser. In a normal situation, a survivor may be able to leave the house. She gets a bit of distance from the perpetrator, but now they are stuck in the house all day. And it's definitely a lot more dangerous for her to seek help in this situation, as the abuser could be monitoring her every move. And the third reason is that in a time of financial crisis, survivors may become even more financially dependent on the abuser. So it can make it a lot harder for them to leave the abuse.
NGOs, including WAO, All Women's Action Society, and Sisters in Islam, have extended their hotline operations so that survivors can contact them at any hour of the day. Hotline operators help women form an escape plan and also provide them with legal advice and counseling services. Despite efforts to overcome new limitations, organizations still have to contend with long-standing issues, all of which are now compounded under the MCO.
One of the big challenges we face is the lack of shelter services for domestic violence survivors. So even before the MCO, there had already been a great need for shelter services. And during the MCO, this need has only become greater. Something that we are recommending the government to do is to establish more temporary shelters for survivors, providing hotels and hostels to survivors who need emergency shelter. The second one would be we need to have clearer SOPs on responding to domestic violence during the MCO. As part of these SOPs, it must be clarified how survivors can obtain interim protection orders and emergency protection orders during this time. And for the women who have already left abusive relationship, for many of them, they have been financially affected by the COVID-19 situation. Many of them have lost employment or have a reduction in income due to the MCO.
According to WAO, among the 20 former residents of their domestic violence shelter, 30% are unable to work due to the MCO, 25% are still looking for a job, while another 5% had their salaries reduced. Activists and organizations have been working hard to help survivors by providing shelter and funds, lobbying for more resources, and involving themselves in coalitions to support various networks of women and refugees across the nation. But the rest of us play a vital role in protecting and supporting our community. One way we can help these survivors is to stay vigilant. If you suspect that someone you know is in an abusive household, here are 3 steps you can take to help them.
The first is to share with them the WAO hotline number as well as our WhatsApp number and encourage them to contact WAO for support. The second thing you can do is to come up with a code word between the both of you so that if the person is in danger, she could text you the code word in a discreet manner to indicate that she needs help. The third thing that you can do is if you hear your neighbors fighting and you suspect that someone is being abused, you could ring the doorbell and pretend that you want to borrow some supplies. The act of ringing the bell can send a message that the community is watching. You can get someone to accompany you, and if it's an emergency, then you should call 999.
And if you or someone you know is concerned about whether you can call the police or leave a violent household, just know that you definitely can.
So majority of the people who contact us to ask about domestic violence cases, majority of them are the survivors themselves. Survivors are asking us whether or not they are able to leave the situation during the MCO, how exactly to do so. And I think there's also been a lack of clarity as to what kinds of support is available to survivors during this time. In recent weeks, there has been more announcements from the government. So I think that's an important step to inform survivors that they can indeed leave the abuse even during the MCO.
While most of us are trying to fend off boredom, others are trying to fend off abuse. Domestic violence often leads to profound consequences like homicides, suicides, injuries, and chronic physical and mental health problems on not only the target of the abuse, but also on the children in the family who witness these acts of violence. As the pandemic brings in more uncertainties about finances and health, tensions within households will only rack up. Even with COVID-19 devastating our communities, we have to make sure domestic violence doesn't add another toll to our public health crisis.